Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so glad that you are here with us and hope you are having a lovely beginning to your winter season. With that, we are pleased to get started, and I am excited to introduce Anthea Hartig, the Elizabeth Macmillan Director of the National Museum of American History. Anthea, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to our colleagues Stephanie Johnson and Nikki Rosado, who are also helping make today happen. I am Anthea Hartig, and I'm honored to be the Elizabeth Macmillan Director of the National Museum of American History at your Smithsonian institution and the first woman director. So it gives me particular pride to welcome you to this program on the lasting impact of the 19th Amendment in the 19th Amendment centennial year. Remember when 2020 was supposed to be our year, the year of the woman. I'm joining you here in my little 1855 house in Washington, D.C., and I want to acknowledge the precedents of the Piscataway, Palmunkey, Nacotchtank tribes and their descendants. The D.C. region is home to Native peoples from all around the continent. And so wherever you're joining us from, acknowledge and give our respects to Native peoples for the opportunity to work and live in their territories. I'd also like us to pause as we begin our time together and acknowledge this moment of intersecting crises. Of course, the pandemic, the viral crisis, racial, economic, climate, and lingering political crises as well. As many of you know, Secretary Lonnie G. Bunch made the difficult decision to again close the Smithsonian museums, including ours, that had reopened, of course, as a public health precaution due to the accelerating spread of COVID-19. However, whether our building is open or closed, we remain committed to our work for caring for the nation's treasures, producing scholarly research, planning for future exhibitions, and providing digital and educational resources for students, teachers, caregivers, and folks like you who are joining us from around the nation. We were honored at the National Museum of American History to highlight the stories of women in several ways this year to celebrate the Year of the Woman, all of which are available digitally. These efforts, as you might guess, are critically important to me, and it's an honor to help and steward them and shepherd them along. In October, we opened Girlhood, It's Complicated, with support from the Smithsonian American Women's Initiative, sharing how girls have changed history and what it has been like to grow up female in the United States. Girls, like suffragists, use their voices to make a difference. We also opened a new case in the American Enterprise exhibition on the history of business entitled The Only One in the Room, exploring stories of 8 women who made their mark in respective industries, and will open picturing women inventors with our Lemelson Center for Invention and Innovation in early 2021. Today, we're focusing on a wonderful exhibition that opened days before we closed, March 6th, in a beautiful opening, Creating Icons, How We Remember Women's Suffrage. The exhibition highlights women's achievements in winning suffrage, but also invites our audiences to consider whose stories were left out of the traditional suffrage narrative. I want to thank the donors who made this exhibition possible. Our friends Bob and Lynn Euler, Kathleen Manat and Michelle Manat, Sandy, Cindy, Jaden, Thea, Sabrina, and William Siegel, the Smithsonian Women's Committee, Diane Spry-Straker, Ambassador Nicholas Taubman and Mrs. Eugenia Taubman, and Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. I'm pleased that we're able to extend Creating Icons through August of next year of 2021, so there'll be more time to see the powerful objects and the stories within. The exhibition allows us to explore how dynamic and diverse stories come to light when we approach history with care and consideration, so that then we can lift up icons who will inspire the current and the next generation of women's rights activists. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today an incredible woman herself, whose work and advocacy has impacted our nation, along with a panelist of wonderful women leaders who inspire me every day. First one up, though, is Lisa Kathleen Grady, a curator of political history and the project director for creating icons, how we remember women's suffrage. Take it away, Lisa.
Thank you, Anthea. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for joining us today. Now, we've been spending this year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It's a landmark moment that deserves commemoration, but anniversaries also are times for contemplation and evaluation. In 1920, the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution meant that women could no longer be excluded from the polls because of their sex, but it didn't guarantee them ballots. Women in all states could now vote, and many of them did. But some women of color, immigrant women, and poor white women faced the same voting discrimination as their male counterparts. Now, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was a victory. It was also one step in a long, continuing journey to equality on so many fronts. And to say that the story of suffrage is complicated is putting it mildly. 70 plus years of competing priorities, philosophies, tactics, and alliances played out over the decades as idealism and activism ran headlong into practical politics. Multiple generations of women of all classes and races across the United States worked for suffrage and women's rights. Their struggle started in the early 1800s as women in communities across the country began calling attention to the political and social inequalities that affected their lives. It grew through abolition and temperance movements, which provided opportunities for both white and free African American women to develop as advocates and leaders and to build alliances. For many, issues of race, class, citizenship, freedom, and womanhood were intertwined with the quest for voting rights. Some, especially Asian immigrants and Native Americans, were barred from citizenship and wouldn't benefit immediately from women's enfranchisement. Nevertheless, they campaigned for suffrage, believing that they would eventually cast ballots as free and equal citizens of the United States. And together, they won voting rights in 28 states before the 19th Amendment was ratified, and state by state, equality was no longer necessary. In creating icons, we look at some of the women we've heard about, Susan B. Anthony, for example, but we also introduce other women to visitors, women like Mary Walker, Dr. Mary Walker, a Civil War surgeon and activist who challenged suffrage leaders and became notorious for wearing men's-styled suits. African-American educator and prolific speaker Nannie Helen Burroughs, who established the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention and founded the National Training School for Women and Girls here in Washington, D.C. Alice Paul, whose militant National Woman's Party was a challenge to the conservative suffrage leaders. Abolitionist and feminist Frances Harper, who in a famous 1866 speech explained that white women must factor African-American women's double burden of sex and race into the fight for women's rights and suffrage. Journalist and anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells, who founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago in 1913 and famously refused to march in a segregated section of a suffrage parade that same year in Washington. Nina Otero Warren, who headed the New Mexico chapter of Alice's militant National Woman's Party and ensured that their materials were printed in Spanish as well as English. Marie-Louise Bottineau Baldwin championed Native American rights, and in 1913, she marched with fellow lawyers in the Washington, D.C. suffrage parade. And Dr. S.K. Chan, president of the Chinese American Equal Suffrage Society in Portland, Oregon, gave a pro-suffrage speech in Chinese in 1912, emphasizing that her birth country of China had already enfranchised women. Through the suffrage movement, these women became leaders, lobbyists, speakers, activists, and strategists. It was a training ground for the women who would move into politics, government, and leadership in a post-suffrage amendment world. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin of Montana became the first woman elected to the United States House of Representatives. She was the ranking Republican member of the House's newly formed Women's Suffrage Committee, and 2 years later opened the floor debate on the amendment. But in 1918, she ran and lost a race for the Senate. Now, the consequence of that election was that in 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, there were no women serving in the United States Congress. But on the 100th anniversary of the amendment that Rankin championed, 131 of the 541 delegates, representatives, and senators were women. Some of them joined us in our suffrage celebration. Led by Senators Marsha Blackburn and Dianne Feinstein, the women of the Senate shared their reflections on the impact of the suffrage movement and what it means to them. You can read them on the Creating Icons website at the National Museum of American History. Senators Blackburn and Feinstein came together with our director, Anthea Hartig, to create the introductory video that we're about to share with you.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote
shall not be denied or abridged by the United States
or by any state on account of sex.
In thinking about the 19th Amendment's passage, where no women were sitting in Congress, thinking about where they had come since the first convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, you find in their writings and in their advocacy and in their marches and in their hunger strikes and in their petitions an incredible, deeply devoted desire to change the world to the good. We're so fortunate here at the National Museum of American History to have in our collection remarkable materials, some put into the museum by the very women who won the right to vote in 1920. That helps us tell the long arc of struggle and of sacrifice and of dogged determination. And this project in which senators and congresswomen reflect upon their roles now is, in my mind, part of a grand continuum of women's advocacy to be represented, to be heard, and to be equal partners, not just in families, but in the very nation itself.
When I was first elected to the Senate in 1992, there were only 2 women in the Senate. The election was dubbed the Year of the Woman because 4 women were actually elected to the Senate. Today, that number stands at 26.
When I was elected to the Tennessee State Senate in 1998, I quickly realized I was a caucus of 1. I was the only Republican woman in the room. Now, I am one of 26 women in the United States Senate.
When young girls see women sitting in powerful positions, it tells them they can do the same thing in their career. It's amazing what happens each time we shatter a glass ceiling.
We know this: we need to encourage female leaders in their communities to step up and take on the challenge of running for public office.
Today we look across the landscape of women's activism and we see what we call intersectionality, which means we have women of multiple backgrounds, multiple races, multiple ethnicities, and multiple perspectives fighting for a broad set of powerful and ongoing struggles. That wasn't always the case. So the activism that you see then leading up to the 19th Amendment is in many respects the same activism we see today. The work that lies ahead of us is to continue to broaden to the deepest and most expansive and most inclusive frame possible that all women, regardless of where they are, what color they are, where they're from, are not denied or abridged in their capacities to vote.
Now, I'm excited to speak to some of the leaders who are creating the history of what happens next and becoming icons themselves. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mayor Muriel Bowser. In 2018, she was the first woman ever to be reelected as the mayor of Washington, D.C. Because Washington, D.C. is unique in the American political system. Chief executive functions as a governor, county executive, and mayor, all rolled into one. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., she previously served as a Ward 4 councilwoman and first entered elected office as an advisory neighborhood commissioner in the Riggs Park neighborhood. Secretary Barbara Hackman Franklin Currently, she is president and CEO of Barbara Franklin Enterprises, advising companies and doing business internationally. She held a number of government positions, including serving as the 29th U.S. Secretary of Commerce under President George H.W. Bush, an original commissioner of the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, and a staff assistant to President Richard Nixon. In that role, Franklin led the first White House effort to increase the number of women in high-level policymaking positions, a story which was told in the book A Matter of Simple Justice, The Untold Story of Barbara Hackman Franklin and a Few Good Women. She is also, we're proud to say, a member of the American History Museum's Advisory Board. And we'll be sharing video of Representative Doris Matsui, who is joining us in spirit, but regrets that her schedule in Congress wouldn't allow her to attend in person today. Representative Matsui has represented the city of Sacramento and its surrounding areas since 2005. She succeeded her late husband, Robert Matsui, who served in Congress from 1979 till 2005. She serves as a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, including the Health, Environment, and Climate Change and Consumer Protection and Commerce subcommittees, and is the vice chair of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. She's also a member of the Smithsonian's Board of Regents, as well as a member of the advisory board of the National Museum of American History. Such a friend to the Smithsonian that we feel her in spirit even when she can't be with us. So it's hard to read body language in Zoom, but we're going to give it a try for a lively conversation. Now, according to the census reports, since 1984, women have turned out at higher rates than men for presidential elections. Their votes are prized, analyzed, and fought over. So how can women better leverage that interest in their concerns after the polls close? Secretary Franklin, how about you?
Well, campaigns are very important, but I would say that democracy never sleeps. And just because a campaign is over in which there was an issue that was very important to us having to do with women, that doesn't mean that it's over. And we really have to, all of us who care about whatever the issue is, from whatever chairs we are sitting in, whatever organizations we are part of, we just need to carry on to make sure that the issue comes to fruition, whether it's pay equity or whatever. And some wise person once said, you know, in the public sector, things never stay settled. You think they're settled, but then they change backwards or they unravel. So that's why if you care about an issue, you really have to carry on after the election is over.
Next, we're going to play the answer from Representative Matsui.
Having people who share your perspective and experiences in places of power is instrumental in moving the needle towards change. I think we can better leverage interest in our issues by ensuring we're electing women who champion them. We need women in positions of power who understand that our problems are not talking points. We must elect people who truly fight for the issues that affect us. But, you know, that's not all. Movements like the Women's March and other community-led movements who provide platforms to women are also instrumental in raising the profile of crucial issues. You know, groups like Women's Demand Action come to mind as a prime example, a vocal organization who have made gun violence an important issue for women. As a member of Congress, I have a constituency that I am in constant contact with. I know what is important to them because they are telling me, either directly, through daily calls to my office, through emails, or by their attendance to the marches and events in my district. We must continue to be vocal. We must continue to push the agenda that we want. We must keep encouraging each other to be in positions of power. That is a way that we continue to influence policy and create a more equitable America for us all. And as we said in the Women's Caucus, when women succeed, America succeeds.
Mayor Bowser.
I think that's a fantastic question. And we especially see that dynamic in the African American community. And it is very important that people recognize that their votes count and that their votes matter. And the way that I've seen that in all of my elections is the government has to do what it says it's going to do, and activists have to hold leaders accountable. And so, as we heard Ms. Franklin talk about, there have been very powerful advocacy groups that have developed over the years, and many are led by women. The women are doing the fundraising and the activity building. And some of these groups are becoming so mature now that women are passing down the leadership and training other women to take their place. And I think all of those issues are very important. But I think that as a person who is elected, that voters stay relevant after the election is can have an agenda and to very frequently hold officials accountable to that agenda. And sometimes people think they work really hard to get somebody elected and that person is probably a friend in some ways, but that doesn't mean you don't hold your friends accountable.
Practical politics. In the Museum's Creating Icons exhibition, we explore the fact that the priorities and concerns of the women involved in the suffrage movement weren't always the same. They were shaped by race, class, opportunity, ethnicity, culture, and even geography. This is just as true 100 years later.
Yes.
2020, how can we recognize these differences, these different priorities and concerns, and use them to do the most good for the most women?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and it's kind of been a buzzword in organizing is to recognize and figure out how to take advantage of the intersectionality of so many movements that women are a part of. And sometimes the goals of those various movements are similar, but sometimes they conflict. But there's almost always a thread of commonality that run through women's movements. And one of the ones that I think that resonates across all spectrums is equal pay for equal work. And similarly, childcare, I think is going to be the emerging issue. It's already an issue, but I think it's going to come to the forefront of those issues. And I dare say that there were similar issues with the suffrage movement. So there's some things about being a woman that haven't changed in all of that time. But I think that given women's prominence, not only in voting, but in professions, college campuses, and activist movements, and growing in Congress, not so much growing in state houses, getting a little bit closer in the White House, but given all of the growth of women in those positions, I think the opportunity to leverage intersectionality will only increase.
Fantastic. Thank you. Secretary Franklin.
I sure agree with what the mayor just said about certain issues just cut across women, period, no matter where you are. I do think equal pay is one. I think women in more leadership positions is another. And we really have to be working on that. One of the things that has impressed me about the women suffragists was their differences, and they had them, but they never lost sight of the fundamental goal, and that was the vote. And I think that's the important thing to remember today. There are lots of different issues, but let's not lose sight of where we are trying to go. And that is more gender parity everywhere we can find it. And to me, women in leadership.
We asked Representative Matsui to weigh in on this question as well.
If you look back at modern American history, it's obvious now that strong, dedicated women from all walks of life, ages, races, classes, and backgrounds have impacted our lives today. But in many ways, we are just beginning to tell these important stories. Women from diverse backgrounds, economic, cultural, social, and so on, need a seat at the table in real and substantive ways, whether that is in elective offices or in boardrooms. When we talk about women's issues, we must consciously try and include a holistic viewpoint that reflects all our values, not just a privileged few. We must address the social, economic disparities that affect women of various ages, races, and classes differently. And we must understand that we cannot compartmentalize issues as just women's issues. Our issues are everyone's issues. But we can still do more. We have to continue to keep our doors open, welcome diversity in all its forms, and make sure that we use our immense power to work toward outcomes that create positive change for the most women possible.
I'm really curious about the next question and the responses from you, Secretary Franklin, and you, Mayor Bowser, because you did come to the positions you hold. You took such very different paths in public service. From your perspectives, what are the opportunities and obstacles for women in public service? Have things gotten better than they were when you entered public life? And how do we create more opportunities for women and overcome the obstacles that still remain? And Secretary Franklin, you had an entire career in doing just that. So I'd love to hear your answer to that.
Where I started in public service has got to go back 50 years to 1971, when I joined the White House of President Richard Nixon as a first to in turn recruit women for the top policy-making jobs in government and be his point person on this whole project that he wanted done. Well, I began by running around the country, literally, looking for women who would be willing to come into government and that we could consider appointing. One big obstacle, I would say the biggest one, if you go back 50 years, was that there was not consensus in our society about the role of women. And there were many who thought women really should just be homemakers and stay at home. And if women did work, well, they were, in those days, they were more teachers, nurses, and secretaries than anything else. Important roles, but if you could find a woman lawyer or a scientist or head of a business, that was a lot tougher. Well, I would say, and I'm proud of what we were able to do back then, because many of the women we appointed were first woman who chairs regulatory commissions, first woman in the White House as an economist, first woman doctor at the VA. But the point is, once those barriers come down, then it's easier the next time. And that's much better today, I must say. Not perfect, but much better. And we've now just recently seen some barriers broken. I think the Secretary of the Treasury to be a woman. I compliment President-elect Biden on that one. I think that's great. The other obstacle I would mention had to do with the stereotypes about women in these roles. Women might be too emotional or too weak or too tough to do some of these jobs. Now, I think a lot of that has dissipated as well because there have been more women in these roles, but that one hasn't gone away. And there still, to me, is silent resistance to women in leadership in particular. I think we still have to overcome some of these stereotypes and what a woman leader is supposed to look like, act like, perform like, how she balances her life and her family and her work and so on. It's much better than it was, but we still have, I think, a few mountains to climb here. But I do think things are better, and women now really need to support each other and step forward if they want to do public service, get elected to the school board first or whatever, and understand what that means. There are some sacrifices. I'm sure the mayor can talk about that. There are some sacrifices and there are some risks, but there are wonderful opportunities, and you really can feel good about what you have done for others and for your country. So I would encourage younger women to think about public service.
Yeah. Mayor Bowser, you have a classic local government path to public service.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I can only imagine what Secretary Franklin experienced in 1971 with that task, and we're grateful that she did it. I am the second female mayor of Washington, D.C., and I'm the only one to have been elected twice. My predecessor, Sharon Pratt, was elected in the late 80s. And at that time, she was the only woman leading a big city. So I think a lot of things have changed with regard to female executives. I agree very much with the secretary in saying I think our country still has some getting used to when it comes to female executives. So women have been elected certainly to Congress and on any manner of other local offices, but we have some work to do with female executives, and then I think we will elect a female president. And so I also think it is a great responsibility of mine to kind of demystify running for office and being in office, because I think women tend to want to wait until they're perfect or they can be the perfect candidate. And men are not burdened by that desire. So we have to, those of us who have been in these positions, somewhat demystify the process. And like most things, it's about hard work, putting one foot in front of the other and putting yourself out there and being prepared when you are. I think that the difference, and I have seen some improvement over my 13 years in elected life, but I do think that women are more quickly criticized, more wrongly criticized, more frequently criticized. And the thing that I would say that has changed is I see more women coming to each other's defense and more men and defending women when they're being wrongly criticized.
I think that's absolutely right from where I sit. There's a different standard that women are held to. I guess I put that under the general stereotype category, and we've got to work to get rid of that. But I really want to say something else about leadership. I think when there are crises, the caliber of a leader really shows. And here I want to compliment you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you.
Because you've had them this year, and I compliment you on the way you have handled everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Throwing you one that wasn't on the questions we thought we'd ask, but you both made a very solid point about the ideal of a woman in political power, the ideal of a woman in leadership, and how the problems that women have trying to dispel this idea of what a woman should be and how perfect a woman should be. And I wonder if you think that this has changed. Both of you mentioned encountering it. Has that changed at all over this 50-year continuum? Because my feeling is almost that it hasn't really.
I think it's better. I mean, the more women we see who are mayors, now a vice president, a governor, I think the more women we see, I do think there's change. And the same thing I could flip to the private sector. I think the more women CEOs we see, for example, then that begins to change because they all look different. But there are only 37 out of the Fortune 500 who are women right now. Now that's not a very big number, is it? So if you look at some of this numerically, you could say, oh goodness, we have a long way to go. But I do think that some of the imagery around what a woman is supposed to be, I think we're chipping away at that. And I'd be interested in what the mayor thinks from where she sits.
I think there has been progress as well. And I think it really does come down to seeing women do it. And we can only imagine what a female president would be like because we've never seen one. And I saw a graphic that's going around the internet recently of every vice president that we've had in boxes, and then Kamala Harris next to it. It was such a powerful image to me because now we can actually see it. I had the experience, and I know I hear this from other women, 8-year-old little girls are very perceptive creatures. And I found that's when they really start paying attention to leaders and who they're seeing on TV. When I ran for mayor the first time, I had a block of 8-year-old little girls who, if they could have voted for me, I would have for sure been a lock because they began to imagine, oh, she's a girl, I'm a girl. That sounds like an important thing that she's doing. And they could start seeing themselves do it. And I see the same thing when I look at the vice president elect and the impact she's having on girls who may not know the first thing about politics, but they know that that's an important job. She's a girl, I'm a girl. I should be thinking about an important job too. So it's not a sophisticated point, but it's the most true is that seeing other women in leadership is important for everyone.
It's important for men to see also.
Absolutely.
And that is
Young men.
Uh-huh.
that's a perfect lead into my next question. And because leadership is more than political, we're going to invite our director, Anthea Hart, to answer this as well, because it's something that the museum weighs in on every day. Now, ratification of the 19th Amendment meant that women could no longer be excluded from the polls because of their sex, but it didn't guarantee them ballots. African American, Latina, Native American, Asian American, immigrant, poor white women were starting to face some of the same voting discrimination as their male counterparts. Similarly, as our nation faces a new reckoning of racial injustice today, it's clear that while women in government are a minority, women of color are represented even less. So how do we see today's conversation echoing these problems of the past? And what, in your experience, can be done to increase representation in government?
We are seeing it throughout government, maybe not on every level. When I think about our own government, when I made a point in hiring my senior officials to make sure that my cabinet looked like the District of Columbia. When I look at the pipeline of people who are in line to take over in leadership positions, I think it's pretty well diverse. We have a lot of gender diversity. And the other thing that I think that we have to do, I'll talk about a workplace now, is to be a good place to work. And I find that, we attract a lot of women and we have a lot of diversity because we're a good place to work for women. First of all, we're going to have a harassment-free environment, and we take that very seriously. People are promoted on their merit and they're given opportunity. And we encourage creativity, and I let people do their jobs. So I think one way to have a really diverse organization is to be a values-led organization. I find that women are attracted to organizations where they're treated fairly and they can excel on their merit.
Thank you. We're going to play Representative Matsui's answer now, and then I'm going to ask Anthea and then Barbara, if you can respond as well.
I think it's important to put this in context. I remember the first time I voted. When I looked down at the names listed on the ballot, I didn't see any names that reflected my own. At that time, I couldn't really have fathomed that all these years later, it would be my name on that ballot. Looking over the rest of the ballot this year, it was clear we've made important strides. Our most shining example is that we will soon have Vice President Kamala Harris. Yet, we have a way to go. The events of this past year were a wake-up call for many across the nation. The fact is that the society we live in systematically oppresses people of color. Yet every day, there is a pervasive refusal to acknowledge this reality, and that creates an immense amount of pain for so many people. For people who have felt the effects of racism and discrimination, it can feel like we are having the same conversation over and over again. I think that we are seeing today is exactly how we increase representation in government. We've seen a generation of strong young women lift up their voices and get into what my good friend John Lewis called good trouble. And although we continue to fight against racial discrimination and sex discrimination, what we have seen is that these voices are making it through the outside noise and being heard. And I think that is something I can't help but be optimistic about.
That's great. I think that both Congresswoman Matsui and you, Mayor Bowser, articulated some of the key elements to this, and representation, sense of the beloved community, to paraphrase Dr. King's words, is something that women, I think, do naturally. I think that there's a sense of both compassion as well as accountability And as well, I think an added critical element of understanding that the culture that we can create, and you're mentioning workplace culture, I think is so critical, and it's valid. And on the representation side, as historians and educators and curators, we think so much about that. And for the National Museum, the People's Museum, for it to be truly the People's Museum, we need everyone who comes in to see themselves reflected in the past, because they're there. And the stories that Lisa Kathleen was able to pull up and through to talk about the complexities of suffrage, to go up to the 1977 conference, to go through the fight for ERA, and to come all the way up to the great women's marches of 2017 are those ways in which we can continue that representation, and then to set high goals for ourselves and to continue to meet those goals of representation and access and equity. I joke that the great thing about being the first woman director is that no other woman will ever have to say that again.
Is powerful. I've seen that any number of ways through not just the last 50 years, but even before. When you gather a group of people who are diverse in terms of color, ethnicity, gender, experience, culture, around the same table to solve a problem, it's going to be a better solution. And that's true in small things and in large things. So that's the power, and I think our society could certainly benefit from it. Now, how do you get there? Well, you have to have a plan for getting there. You have to have a will to get there. And I can tell you that 50 years ago, I had a goal. When I took that job in the White House, the president said, okay, I want the numbers of women in these highest level jobs to double in a year. I'm proud to say, through a lot of people's helping, we did that in 6 months.
Amen.
It just shows you that if you have a plan and you have ways to activate people, we literally had goals. So the cabinet departments did too. And there was to be diversity as well. And this was gender, but we also were looking for women of color and of Asian extraction too. And so that's how it gets done. I think you have to have a will, and then you have to have a plan for doing it, and you've got to do it. And you've got to monitor how you're doing. Turn around once in a while and say, well, how are we doing? Are there really now enough women in whatever appointed groups or our Congress or wherever? And then there ought to be some kind of reward. Now, the reward in this day, I'm talking about 50 years ago, the reward if a cabinet secretary did a good job was that he got a nice note from the president. And I know that because I was drafting the notes and they were going upstairs. but I mean, that can be little things like that from whoever the head of an organization is, can be very powerful. And really, once again, we keep talking about leadership, but leadership in getting this done and having more representation of people who are not represented as well as they should be does come from the top. It comes from the bottom too, but you really need it coming from both ways.
And as the great Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't offer you a chair, bring a folding one. And I know that I'm sorry?
I was just going to say she was one of my heroes. I knew her, and I admired her greatly. She was so courageous and so smart. And at the time she did what she did, which was to run she was the first woman, I think, who ran for president as a Democrat, and the first woman of color. I think it was both. And then Margaret Chase Smith was the one on the Republican side. Mm-hmm. Same thing. Yeah.
Now, I know the audience has questions, so Sarah is going to shepherd those through.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much. We already have some great ones. So the first question from Suzanne Noonan reads, it seems to me that the strongest barrier to women attaining leadership in any sphere is the lack of accessible and affordable high quality childcare. Do you see any hope on the horizon that we can successfully address this national issue? Perhaps Mayor Bowser, if you're willing to speak.
Sure. Let me start, because I couldn't agree with the questioner more. And even before the pandemic in DC, we found that we did not have enough childcare slots in every part of the city to meet demand. And that then presented us with a great challenge for our growth. We won't be able to attract and keep families if they can't find affordable and high quality childcare. So over the last 6 years, we've been making very heady investments in it. Now, childcare, in my view, the business model is in need of some innovation because the market is not solving for childcare because childcare providers, they're not entering the space enough to keep up with demand. So I think we have to think about it. Some of it may be some regulatory changes, but I think also we need entrepreneurs to think about that space. I frequently challenge entrepreneurs, especially our tech friends. They haven't necessarily been attracted to solving human services problems, from food to infants and mom healthy babies initiatives to childcare. And I think we need to be thinking about that model so that we can better attract a business model that works. Now, having said that, this is also something that I think we need to think about nationally to help solve. And it can't just be on a local level. Like in DC, we have programs that we can provide locally, and childcare is one of them that begs for a national solution. Some of it could be around business mandates, but there may be a benefit component to it as well. But it is going to be one of the issues that COVID reveals that really impacts our economy. Just think about the number of women who have completely dropped out of the workforce because of the childcare issues that COVID has exposed.
And thank you, Mayor Bowser. And if I may add, and there's a nice comment in the chat from Becky, along with childcare innovation, and I would even say maybe revolution, considered pay equity for childcare workers. And that is also, again, traditionally held positions of women classically underpaid or lower paid, as well as you know, inherited contours of race and discrimination, and that are all tangled up in how, especially we as mothers, can both never mind lead, but just work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of historic precedent for that. And I think, Barbara would probably agree that every moment in which, throughout time in which women's rights have been considered, that childcare is on the table. And I do hope it's our generation, multiple generations of women leaders that can figure that out.
Yep.
I think this has to be our time, especially with the next administration. So.
I've lost, as a perfect example, I've lost an employee in my company for this very reason. COVID has precluded her, would be her parents, the grandkids, to come in and help with childcare. So she decided she couldn't do it. She couldn't work and she couldn't childcare. She has two babies at the same time. So I'm experiencing it firsthand what has happened here. And I think the solutions, I think you're both saying some very good things here, but I think the solution is not simple. And I don't think it's going to be a completely federal solution either, or a state or a governmental solution. I think private sector
Public-private
process has got to get in here. And maybe we get the techies, as Miriam was saying, get the techies to think about this one and how we do it, because it has run through everything, this whole business of how you do balance careers and families. And from when I was working on recruiting and until now, and we still haven't, I'm not sure we've really faced the issue or kind of written it down the way I like to write down, here's the issue and what are we trying to solve? I think we need to do some more of that kind of thinking about this.
And as the beloved belated Justice Ginsburg was fond of saying, it's also about, it's not just women's liberation, it's men's liberation we're talking about, right? That it's this, it has to be this in the entirety of, our collective gender experience to liberate all of us. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. One more, I think it's a really nice one to end on. So as we look to the next generation of young women who are coming of age to vote and to start their careers, what gives you hope? What advice would you give to young women and girls who want to be engaged either in politics and government or just as activists and organizers?
I have a challenge for younger people. Know what you would like to do and what you're good at and passionate about. And then do it. And in the mix of that needs to be this whole gender parity, equity thing. And what I'm saying to you is that now you need to do it. We're not going to quit just because we're getting older and because we've done some things. We're not going to quit, but we're passing the torch to you. This is now your time, your challenge to push gender equity further, faster, and particularly from where I sit, women in leadership across the board, public sector, private sector in business, in cultural arts organizations, in academia, in sports, everywhere. This is your time. And to me, this is your challenge. So go for it.
The thing that I would say that I just so love about young people is they seem so open-minded. They don't have even of my generation, they don't seem to have the same hang-ups with race and difference. And this generation, I think, is really going to help us achieve a post-racial America. And that's what really excites me about them. They're open-minded and they grew up with diversity and a disdain for people being treated differently because they're different. And I just think that's more prevalent with this generation than any generation that I've seen. So that gives me a lot of hope about a more fair and diverse America.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to both of you. I think back as a girl, when I was a girl, this is a great multi-generational panel. Barbara, you were diversifying the White House when I was 7 years old. And I believed, I didn't know you, I'm so thrilled to know you now, but I actually believed growing up that we were created equal. That surge in the 70s that has fits and starts until where we find ourselves now. I'm hoping for the next generations of men and women, and for all of our many fellow Americans who have a fluidity of gender identity, that, to your point, Mayor Bowser, that they call us out. They're more unafraid. They call us out in our biases. Expose it, hashtag it. I think they are willing to speak truths that many people have spoken before them, but they do it in ways, you're right, that they have come from a spot of a really beautiful set of acceptances of our differences. And I was struck by what Senator Feinstein said when she was first in the Senate in 1992. I was starting my career as a historian. And of course, there were two women senators, and they were both from California, where I'm from. And so I realized the difference in thinking. I grew up with women senators, and I realized I was the only one. 40 million of us, but you know what I mean.
As opposed to me, I grew up with no senators.
There's hope.
I don't want my daughter to grow up with no senators.
Exactly. Talking about representation. That's probably for another conversation.
Yes, another day.
But this has been such a delightful conversation, and we're so grateful to you, Secretary Franklin and Mayor Bowser, for your generations of leadership and for all you do to inspire generations of the future.
And we encourage you to explore the online exhibition of Creating Icons, How We Remember Women's Suffrage,